Hi, welcome to History 1301. I'm Professor Cahan, and this is Lecture 2, New World Slavery. Today, slavery is a political battleground still in the United States, even though slavery was abolished in 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. There are still ongoing debates about reparations, apologies for slavery, museums, where museums should be located, whether there should be museums located in certain places, how do we memorialize the institution of slavery. It's important to understand that slavery was crucial, it's absolutely pivotal to the creation of the so called New World. But the problem for most Americans is that we don't understand how all encompassing slavery was, or many don't understand or will not accept how all encompassing slavery actually was. They think of it as an aspect of African American history or an aspect of Southern history, but they don't think of it as interconnected with the entirety of the development of the United States. But it is critical, it's crucial to understand slavery if we want to understand the United States. Now, some facts about the institution of slavery in the United States. We've got a very unclear view of what slavery actually was. Sometimes, if we look at Hollywood portrayals of slavery, we see it portrayed in a fairly benign way. When we look at movies like Gone with the Wind, which was recently subject of a controversy on HBO, it portrays slavery as almost this benign institution where the enslaved were practically servants, but they were almost kind of familial in their relationships with the slave owners. And it provides a context for how we misunderstand slavery. A more realistic portrayal of slavery would be the story of a man named Gordon, a runaway slave in Tennessee who fled to Union Army lines in 1863 during the American Civil War. When Gordon fled to Union Army lines, he was treated for some wounds, and the doctor who examined him noted the scarring on Gordon's back. And what you see on this image on the screen here is what's called keloid scarring. It's the result of being whipped over and over and over again. And the doctor decided that somebody needed to document this, that he wanted to write up what he had discovered, but he also knew nobody would believe him if he didn't provide some sort of physical evidence. So he asked that Gordon be photographed so that people would understand precisely how bad the institution of slavery was, how violent it was, so that and use this in a way to drum up support for fighting the Civil War. So this is a more realistic image of slavery. A more realistic understanding of the institution of slavery is these children in this watercolor that you see on the board. Children being ripped from their families. People who talk about things like heritage and institutions in certain parts of the country talk about how slave owners took care of people and how they helped create families and how they helped create something out of nothing. And the reality is that slave owners destroyed family bonds. Slave owners ripped children out of the arms of their parents and sold them off and commodified every single part of an enslaved person's life. We see human beings being treated like livestock during the institution of slavery. What you see on the board is a still from a movie called Quilombo, which came out in 1984. And this still shot depicts a spreader being inserted into an enslaved person's mouth so that a doctor can come and examine the enamel on their teeth and see what sort of nutrition levels this person has. This is exactly how veterinarians examine livestock as sort of a part of a first initial examination. So the institution of slavery treated human beings literally as livestock. We see people being bound together. We see them being marched from interior parts of Africa to the coastal regions. They are being connected not only by chains around their arms and legs or hands and feet, but also by what's called a coffle, the thing that's connecting the two men in the center of this etching here. That thing is called a coffle, and it connects these two so that if they escape, they're going to or if they try to escape, they're going to be bound to one another. They're not going to be able to really kind of separate. Uh, and also, what another thing that we see in this image is an African participating in the slave trade. These enslaved people are being the term for it is they're being driven to the coastal region by another African. So we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but I also want to make sure that when we get there, we contextualize this properly, so we don't have misunderstandings. Enslaved peoples themselves also carried out some of the more violent functions of enslavement. This particular watercolor painting, again, depicts another African enslaved person, an overseer in this case, carrying out punishment of a runaway slave. And you can see that in the foreground, this person's hand has been cut off. This person is bleeding. This person is being tortured to death as a lesson, as a reminder to others that if you run away, if you disobey orders, you're going to be punished. You can see kind of faintly in the background on the left-hand side that there's an image of something or someone hanging in the background. This is how historians know that this was done as an example to others. Okay, that there's punishment being carried out, and it can be torture like you see in the foreground of the painting, or it can involve hanging until dead in the background of the painting. So keep these things in mind when you're thinking about slavery over the next few weeks, that slavery is this incredibly violent and repressive system. Now, why I say it's so important for Americans to understand the impact of slavery, some things about slavery that not all Americans really understand. The White House, for example, was built using slave labor. Both the original White House that you see in the drawing on the left-hand side and the White House that still exists today at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., both of those buildings were built by enslaved people. We see things within the British monetary system, coins like the guinea, actually depicts an African king on the front of the painting, but it was also named for a part of the West African coast where British ships took the bulk of enslaved people that they wind up bringing over to the Americas. We see major higher learning institutions, places like Brown University and Yale University, being founded on the profits of slavery and profits from slave traders. Now, what I mean by this is not that necessarily that the people who founded Brown and founded Yale were slave holders, but rather they invested in ventures that would bring slaves to the New World, and they would invest in ventures that sold slave-grown agricultural goods across the country, so that these institutions, the people who founded them, the wealth that they gained in order to found these institutions was gained by their involvement in slavery. Hymns like Amazing Grace, as you see pictured on the board here. Amazing Grace was written by a former slave trader. And think about the words. You can see the words. I'm not going to sing the hymn to you, but if you read the words, and especially if you know the hymn, if you think about how the song goes, this is a hymn written where a person is grateful for forgiveness. They know why they have been forgiven, and they talk about how their sins have been great. Okay? It's no wonder that it was a slave trader that actually wrote this piece. Robinson Crusoe was a novel that some of you may have even been asked to read at the grade school level, but Robinson Crusoe was a novel written about a shipwrecked slave trader. We can see this in some of the details in the novel. Also, the relationship that Robinson Crusoe has with his, quote, servant, Friday, indicates the connection to slavery that the author, Daniel Defoe, was attempting to depict. So the point of all of this is that when we think of slavery, we can't think of something that was just tangential, that was just a part of American history. It's a huge, it's more than just a part. It's an enormous, constantly present shadow over the United States. In the 1700s, if we look at places like New York City, for example, 1/3 of the population of New York City was enslaved during this era. This is right before the Revolutionary War. If we look at places like Boston, Massachusetts, 1/4 of the population was enslaved. So slavery, in addition to casting this ever-present shadow, also is clearly not only a Southern institution. If we want to think of it this way, there is no United States until 1776, but right up until the Revolutionary War, slavery is a quote unquote national institution. It exists in literally every single colony. There were as many slaves in the North as there were in the South prior to the Revolutionary War. And even those who said, well, I'm not involved in slavery, don't paint me with that same brush that those slaveholders in the South are painted with, maybe that's true. Maybe it's accurate that they're not directly involved in slavery, but all of the ships that carried agricultural goods across the Atlantic, all the investment in a lot of these ventures came from northern capitalists who took slave-grown agricultural goods and shipped them abroad. So they were always connected. They were always tied to slavery in one form or another. Now, before we move on, I want to emphasize something about the word slavery. The word slavery actually comes from the term Slav, okay, S-L-A-V. And this term, slavery coming from the word Slav, suggests something very important. Slavic groups of people are people from Eastern Europe, people who were at one point part of the Russian Empire, the broader Russian Empire in that particular era. These were people who were at one point slaves to the rest of Western Europe. This is an important point to note. Prior to the era of the 1400s, so prior to 1450 or so, the bulk of enslaved people in the world were actually white and came from Eastern Europe. So when people thought of slavery, they thought of these people from Eastern Europe, these Slavic peoples, and they adapted that word and turned it into the word slave and connected it to the institution of slavery. But most of these people, virtually all of them, were what we would define as white, came from Eastern Europe. In the 1400s, though, something happened. The grandfather of Ivan IV, a guy named Ivan the Terrible, he started consolidating power across Russia. And then Ivan the Terrible himself, who became Tsar of Russia in this particular era, he wound up declaring that the Slavic peoples essentially belonged to him, the emperor of Russia. And by saying this, what he also signaled to the people of Western Europe was, you're not going to be able to buy these people and use them as your coerced labor anymore because they belong to me. I will be using them. So he cuts off Eastern Europe from Western Europe and basically tells these people, you do not have this source for slavery anymore. So you're going to have to find a new source. Now, I want to mention something else here before we move on. This means, first, slavery as a racial issue is a recent trend, not a fairly recent, it is a recent trend. But it also emphasizes, there's something else here. We're going to talk about this in a moment, but we're going to talk about the prevalence of slavery through history. And what I want to point out to you is that just because the Russian emperor says you cannot use these people for slavery anymore, that doesn't mean that Europeans had to use Africans as slaves. This idea of going into Africa and taking people as slaves wasn't a given. If you paid attention in the last lecture, in the Close Encounters lecture, nobody would have looked at Africa and said Africa is on the verge of being enslaved by Europe. Africa was a place of wealth, so nobody had to go to Africa to look for a source of slaves. But something happens, something changes. But I want to, before we get there, I want to talk about why we should actually learn about the institution of New World slavery. And here I want to make a critical distinction. We are going to be, for the most part, discussing New World slavery, slavery that happens, quote unquote, in the New World, and we're going to be kind of putting it next to or juxtaposing it with old world slavery. Now, old world slavery is what some people think of when they think of slavery. They think of the ancient Romans and their slaves, the ancient Greeks and their slaves. If you are into the Bible, you might think of the ancient Hebrews and their enslavement to Egypt. But all of that stuff, that's all old world slavery. We are going to be talking about new world slavery for the most part, and again, putting it next to in comparison to old world slavery. So, why should we learn about new world slavery? Well, first, it produces an extraordinary amount of human suffering. New world slavery is by far, it's not even close, it is by far the single most oppressive form of slavery in world history. It's the most oppressive form of labor exploitation in world history. Now, sometimes well meaning historians and well meaning teachers and well meaning commentators talk about this, and they often suggest that old world slavery was easier than new world slavery. Now, there is not the same level of violence. I would absolutely grant that. But we should not say that just because this one has more suffering and this is by far the most oppressive, it doesn't mean these others aren't oppressive. It's simply a matter of it's not as oppressive. So don't be thinking of it in terms of you've got oppression here in New World slavery, and then down at the bottom is this extreme here of virtually no oppression with slavery. Think of it in terms of slavery is oppressive, and then New World slavery comes along and is even more oppressive. Okay. Secondly, slavery, New World slavery, is the key to the making of the modern world. The New World, as we're calling it at this point, we will stop calling it that at some point. But the New World simply could not have been developed or settled the way that it was without slavery. Now, does that mean it couldn't have been settled without slavery, period? No, that's not what I am suggesting to you. What I am suggesting to you is that the settlement would have happened no matter what. Development would have happened no matter what. But its pace changes, its settlement changes. All of this industry that gets created that we talked about again in lecture 1, all of that happens at a different pace and in a different form without slavery. So it's going to happen no matter what. Europeans were constantly looking for other avenues for trade. They were going to find, quote unquote, the new world no matter what. They were going to, once they found it, they were going to settle it no matter what. Even if you take guys like Christopher Columbus out of the equation and say somebody else got here and did things, or even just we'll keep Columbus in the equation. If people who followed him said, yeah, we're going to do this, but we're not going to do it with slavery, that's fine. They still would have developed industry. They still would have developed cash crops. They still would have settled. It just would have happened at a different rate. It would have happened with maybe a little bit less expansiveness at the start, but it was going to happen no matter what. So when I say it's the key to the making of the modern world and that slavery shapes all of this stuff, understand it's shaping it, not creating it. The third reason why we should learn about New World slavery is slavery in the New World is responsible for the creation of modern racial identities. Modern racial identities. When we think of race today, that's a fairly a modern invention. A lot of people during this particular era, when they talked about race, they would talk race in terms of race the way we today talk about national origin. So to give you an example, they would talk about the French race or the English race or the Russian race or the German race. They're not talking in terms of the color of a person's skin, okay, or or something along those lines. This idea of modern racial identity is a fairly modern sort of invention. The next reason why we should understand it, the fourth reason, is that the so called glories of Western civilization all depended on the institution of slavery. Two of the most creative periods in all of global history were the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. And the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period have something in common. They both happened at a time when slavery was growing at its fastest rate. Several of the people who were key figures of those eras, for example, John Locke in the era of Enlightenment, he was a critical figure of that era. And if some of you, I know we have at least one philosophy major in the class this particular semester, but if any of you are philosophy majors, if any others of you, you know who John Locke is. But for those of you who don't know John Locke is kind of the key figure in creating a lot of American institutional ideas. His ideas influenced the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution. He developed the idea of natural rights. So John Locke is as critical a figure to American history as anybody else. And John Locke, this guy who comes up with the proposition that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, was what he had. He said we're all equal, we all have these rights, but he did it at the same time where he was heavily invested in a slave plantation, a slave and indigo plantation in South Carolina, and he also, during that same time, wrote a major defense of slavery. So he said, we all have these rights that divine from God, or whatever the creative force of the universe you want to think of it as. We all have these rights, well, except for this group of people over here. They don't. So it's a very strange circumstance. As I mentioned in the previous class, Europe's rise to global prominence was predicated on the wealth that they got from coming to the New World, and that wealth depended on the institution of slavery. Shipping, manufacturing, agriculture, gun making, all of these institutions depended on, or all of these economic endeavors depended on the institution of slavery. At one point in its history, 1/3 of all British vessels were involved in slavery in one form or another. A fifth reason why we should understand slavery and why we should study slavery, and I'll just kind of spoil this a little bit, is that, spoil the rest of the semester, I mean, is that virtually all of American history is shaped by the institution of slavery. One thing that we're going to see going forward is that there are going to be a lot of things that happen that on the surface have nothing to do with slavery. But then when we pull back the layers of all of this, we're going to see slavery at the core. So America, as we understand it, is shaped by this institution of slavery. And then finally, slavery has left us in the United States, and globally speaking, slavery has left us with several lasting legacies. Things like racism, things like prejudice, social inequality, underdevelopment. It's it's interesting on some level, but interesting almost sounds like I'm making this a positive thing. So I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it's a coincidence that among the poorest places, the most economically deprived places in the world, are areas where the largest number of slaves were taken from in parts of Western Africa, and places where they had the largest concentration of enslaved people in the New World. If we look at places like Mississippi and Alabama, those were areas that had the largest concentrations of enslaved people, and they are also among the poorest places in the United States. So slavery left us with a legacy of underdevelopment on both sides of this equation. Now, slavery also is a mythical institution on some level, just like when I spoke of Christopher Columbus in Lecture 1. There are myths that abound about slavery. And one of those myths is one of the nicknames of slavery. Slavery was frequently referred to as, quote unquote, the peculiar institution. But the peculiar institution is, I think, a strange name for this institution of slavery. Uh, the word peculiar suggests there's something unusual about it, that there's something somehow different about slavery. And the reality is that most people throughout global history have worked because they were coerced to work. Now, I don't mean coerced to work in terms of if you don't work, you don't get a paycheck. That's not what I mean. What I mean by coerced is that they're forced to work in terms of their physical well-being. They are told they will lose their life. They will lose something. They will be punished somehow for not working. So whether we call a person a slave, a serf, an indentured servant, a peone, or whatever, all of these people function as coerced labor. Now, slavery has also been found in virtually every single society in world history. So slavery is not unusual. There's nothing out there where people could look at it and say, well, slavery is just not that unusual. It's actually common. It's a very common thing that we see. In 1066, which is when England was essentially founded, 10% of the English population was enslaved at that one point. If we look at various points in Greek and Roman history, we see that approximately half of their population was enslaved. We've seen, historians have found slavery in Islamic societies. We've found it in Indian societies, Chinese societies, African societies, Native American societies. So slavery is widespread. It is a common institution. But I also mentioned that when we talk about slavery, we're going to be talking about New World slavery. And all of these things that I've just mentioned, English slavery, ancient Greece and Rome, Indian, Chinese, Islamic, biblical societies, all of those areas, that's old world slavery. So there's, and I've told you we're going to talk about New World slavery. So there has to be something different about it. If we're going to say we're going to discuss this apart from old world slavery, there has to be something different about it, more different just than what happened in quote unquote the New World. So let's take a second and look at why slavery in the New World is different. Why I'm saying I'm using this term, quote unquote, New World slavery. First of all, New World slavery is the only labor system, the only slave labor system in global history that was based solely on race, based solely on race. Now, in the ancient world, in all of those other societies that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, slavery was something that anybody could fall into. Impoverished people could fall into it. People could, quote, sell themselves into slavery to pay off debts. People could wind up being sentenced to slavery for punishment of a crime. But the important part here is that anybody could be subject to slavery. It could be a matter of bad luck. It could be a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time or something along those lines. But it wasn't simply a matter of a person has a different color of skin, therefore we are going to enslave them. Okay. The race basis for slavery is something new. Now, even in the New World, it's unclear who was actually going to be enslaved. If you remember what we talked about again in Close Encounters, Christopher Columbus looked at the indigenous population in the New World and suggested they would make good slaves. We're going to see that people in the Americas are going to continue to think of indigenous people as potential slaves all the way into the 1700s. So they don't really give up on that idea. But because of a lot of Americans looked at the indigenous population and said the susceptibility of those populations to diseases made them an unlikely source, that they would not actually be a long-term solution. So ultimately, in part, these people came up with using Africans as the long-term solution. A second difference here is that there's a distinct lack of access to freedom in New World slavery. Most of the people in the ancient world and in the quote non-Western world saw their descendants become free. They saw their children freed. They saw their grandchildren freed. And the reason for this is that it's not a generational issue. Slavery was not generational in those areas. Now, what I mean by that is that just because a person was enslaved, that did not mean from a legal status that their children was also enslaved. That idea is something that, again, is, if we add these in totality, unique to African slavery here in the New World. It's just not typically a generational thing from a global perspective. A third question or third difference is about the status of the enslaved people. And again, we see a different status for the enslaved people in the New World versus the Old World. In Western societies, in the New World, those societies, enslaved people were to be at the bottom of the social structure. By definition, they were going to be at the bottom of the social structure. In the Old World, we see something different. Again, the offspring of enslaved people were virtually always free by legal code, but the fact that they had people who were enslaved in their family, for example, a person might have their parents. Their parents might still be enslaved, but their parents being enslaved was no impediment to that person's rise in the social order. They could ascend if they were able to do certain things on their own. Their status of their parents didn't determine what was going to happen to these people in their lives. They were going to be able to rise up. They were going to be able to become key citizens within societies. In some Islamic societies, the rulers were themselves of slave descendancy. So slavery is not an impediment to social advancement in the Old World, but in the New World, it's very much an impediment to advancement. If we look at where slaves are supposed to be in the quote unquote social order in the New World, they are meant to occupy the bottom part of a social ladder, the bottom rung of the social ladder. Other people in the New World defined themselves based on their position with slaves. They compared themselves to where they were with slaves, and where they actually were determined their own position in society. So if a person didn't own any land, they didn't own virtually anything, the only thing they owned was their labor, then that person was called a freedman. That freedman probably actually lived from a material perspective. They probably actually lived a tougher life than enslaved people did, because at least in theory, slave owners were required to provide food and shelter and clothing to their enslaved people. But a freedman who, doesn't have quote unquote an owner, doesn't have a job, doesn't have a farm or anything like that, they may be starving. They may not have hardly any clothes. So in a lot of cases, we see a lot in the historical record, a lot of freedmen, as they were called, who lived, materially speaking, worse than enslaved people. But they had something that the enslaved person did not have and never could have, and that was freedom. And that is why the freedmen ranked actually above slaves in society. Then above the freedmen, we have a group of people called yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers own land, but they do not own slaves. Now, it could simply mean a matter of this person owns their own land and thinks owning slaves is immoral, so they've decided not to own slaves. It could also be a simple matter of, while this person owns their own land and grows crops, they cannot afford to own slaves, so they don't. But that's the sort of key distinction here. The key marker is that they own land, but they do not own enslaved people. The next step up from all of that is the slaveholder class. The slaveholder class is a group of people who own land, and they own between 1 and 19 slaves. So a slave holder, the only difference between a slave holder and a yeoman is that they own at least one slave. So if one of those yeomen goes out and buys a slave, he's now a slave holder. And that person takes a step up the social structure. If that same slaveholder then sells their slave, that person drops a level. They go back to being a yeoman. And then, of course, we have people at the very top of this social structure. We have the so-called planter class. These planters own land, and by definition, again, they own 20 or more slaves. There are not a whole lot of large landholding slave owners in what becomes the United States. There are some who own 100 to 200. There is one that I am aware of who owned 560 slaves. But generally speaking, that number of enslaved people was limited to just a couple for each of these slaveholders. There were not tons of those large scale. There's lots of planters because it starts at 20, but the numbers of people who own just hundreds and hundreds of slaves, that's a fairly limited number. But among those people on the social status or the social ladder, people could move up and down from planter to slaveholder to yeoman and freedman. There was possibility for increase and decrease. But no matter what happens, and this is constructed consciously, no matter what happens, none of those people will ever be below the class of a slave from a social standpoint. Now, a third thing to understand about New World slavery and the differences in New World slavery, not only is it based on race, not only is there no access to freedom, not only does it determine one's status in society, but slavery is also the key component of the labor force. It is the engine that drives the modern economy. All of these industries that we talked about as multinational, coffee, chocolate, sugar, tea, tobacco, all of those things are industries that depended on slaveholding. Again, could sugar or coffee or chocolate, could they be grown or made or processed without slaves? Sure, they could. But the profits that people derived, the expansiveness and pervasiveness of those industries comes only because of their connection to slavery. So those industries are changed. So slavery is also the key component of the workforce. These people are going to be so tied to slavery that there's going to be an argument made very early in American history that if you do not have a slave labor force, then you don't have a labor force, period. Now, Northerners are going to increasingly reject that idea, but that's a topic for another day. But the most important thing to take away here is that slavery in the New World is different in virtually every way. People in the Old World saw slavery simply as a matter of fate. It was not quote unquote personal. It wasn't quote because of who you are. It was bad luck. You happened to fall into debt and you had to resort to slavery to save yourself. Or you were sailing somewhere and your ship got attacked by pirates and the pirates sold you into slavery. Okay, so it's not who you are, it's you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. So in the Old World, people looked at it and said anybody might become a slave. In the New World, there's a shift. There's a shift from fate, as I would call it, to ethnicity and the development of modern racism. But again, before the 1450s or so, most Europeans had no contact or very little contact with African slaves. They simply did not look at Africa as the place. As a reminder to you, Europeans had been cut off from the East by the Tsar of Russia, Ivan IV. His grandfather started it. He concluded, he said, nobody from Russia is going to be enslaved to the West. They all, quote, belong to me. So don't be thinking Ivan the Terrible is a benevolent guy and just didn't like slavery. He was terrible for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is he looked at all of those peasants and said, all of these people belong to me, and I can dole them out as I see fit to the ruling class. So the Russian Tsar cuts all of these people off from their first source of slaves, their original source of slaves. Now, the first question we're going to try to hit here is, why do these people go to Africa then? Why do they look to Africa? Well, they're cut off. They had typically, in years prior, people had looked to the Middle East for enslaved people as well. But those areas were also cut off to Europeans. If you remember the map at the end of Lecture 1, where we talked about trade routes into the East, all of those trade routes are also cut off because Islamic rulers looked at invading Europeans and said, we don't even care if you're here only to trade. We don't want you. Just get out of here. So their two key sources are cut off from them. Europeans are wanting slave labor, but they're looking at all of this and going, well, we can't go to the East for it anymore. We can't go to the Middle East for it anymore. So where are we going to go? Ultimately, they settle on Africa, but I want to kind of dismiss a notion here that it was inevitable that people would go to Africa for enslaved people. Just saying that Europe was cut off from their eastern sources does not mean that they had to go to Africa. Even if they were saying, we want slaves, they didn't have to go to Africa for that. They could have come to the conclusion that, well, we need to sail around Africa and go into the East and enslave the Chinese. They could have simply said, well, we don't care what the Tsar says. We're going to still try to engage in the slave trade there. They could have tried various black market escapades, but they're not. It's not a matter of they are fundamental. They're looking at this and going, well, Africa's the only place. Again, every society had slaves, so they could have gone anywhere else to look for slaves. So they don't have to go to Africa. So the key question becomes, why do they go to Africa? And the answer is kind of provided in who pioneers this slave trade. The answer is that when the Portuguese looked at Africa, they saw something happening in Africa. There was a system of slavery that was exploited in Africa by the Portuguese, and how they did it was by going into a place called the Canary Islands. Now, if you look at this map here, you can see just how close the Canary Islands are to the western coast of Africa. In the 15th century, the mid-1400s, the Portuguese start coming into the Canary Islands. Now, the Canary Islands, I'm going to jump a slide here for a second. The Canary Islands were populated by a group of people called the Guanches, Guanches. The Guanches were the indigenous peoples in the Canary Islands. Now, what the Portuguese had in mind, they looked at the Canary Islands and they said, we can grow sugarcane here. Courtesy of the Crusades, the peoples in Europe had developed this sort of unquenchable desire for sugar. So the Portuguese, deciding we don't feel like we're not going to trade with all those people in the East and the Middle East for it, they said, we can grow sugarcane right in the Canary Islands. And when they get there, just like Christopher Columbus did 4 decades later, they look at the natives in the Canary Islands and say, we'll enslave them and they can grow the sugar for us. Well, the Guanches fought back so well that the Portuguese and their successors, the Spanish, wound up literally killing every single Guanche. But we're focused on the Portuguese in the middle of the 1400s. And what they decide, as they realize these people are fighting back too much, they go, well, we need another source for slaves. And if you're the Portuguese in the Canary Islands, here's where proximity does matter. They look at the Canary Islands and they say, well, it's literally right next door to the western coast of Africa. So they go into Africa and they start kidnapping people along the coastal regions of Africa, of Western Africa. They're going into places like the present-day Western Sahara, for example, and taking people, just kidnapping. Okay. Now, the problem for the Portuguese is this: they got to a point where they were kidnapping people, and that's always a troubling thing. But the kingdoms and city states that existed in Africa saw these invaders. They knew people were kidnapping uh, their tribesmen or their subjects or their fellow citizens, depending on what the political structure was. They knew somebody was involved in these kidnappings, and so they too also fought back. And the Portuguese actually fared very badly in these fights. They have a different type of vessel that they're using. They're using essentially the same types of ships that Christopher Columbus used to sail across the Atlantic into the New World. The Portuguese are using those types of ships, and they're not suitable for navigation in shallow waters like the vessels that these African kingdoms and city-states and principalities had created. So these African peoples are actually doing very well against the Portuguese in trying to stop this. And they do so well that the Portuguese conclude, okay, kidnapping isn't going to work. We are not going to be able, number one, to kidnap enough people to make this work, but we're also creating an enemy who is fighting us very effectively. So what the Portuguese decide to do is, instead of actually kidnapping people, they decide they're going to buy people, and they're going to go inland, and they're going to make deals with African kingdoms and African rulers to actually purchase slaves from those African rulers. So this creates a little bit of a problem from a historical perspective. When the Portuguese shift their efforts from kidnap to purchase, the problem here is that the bulk of African slaves are ultimately going to wind up being sold to the New World, to these New World peoples, or transported across the New World, and they're going to be sold by Africans themselves. But we're going to contextualize this. We're not going to just look at that and leave it at face value and say, well, as some have done, and say, well, see, Africans were responsible for enslaving themselves, so we can absolve ourselves of any worry about all of this. That's not exactly accurate. It is true that the overwhelming majority of slaves brought to the New World were captured and sold by Africans. However, it is equally important to note that they would not have been captured and sold in the first place without this unquenchable desire on the part of Europeans for slaves. Europeans began increasing demand for slaves and for labor, and were increasingly willing to pay higher and higher prices for it. So Africa has a system of enslavement already in place. Literally every African kingdom and principality and city-state, all the way down to sort of tribal political organizations, they all had some form of slavery. But it was different. Europeans come in and they plug into that system and they alter everything. Okay? So we've got questions that we need to answer about this New World slavery. Since we've now got Europeans plugging into it, we've got to deal with how many people are actually taken out of Africa. So that's the how many question. How are they captured, which is a separate question. How they're captured, what we're talking about is what's the process by which these people become enslaved? Why Africa? Because we still really haven't answered why Africa, other than to say Europeans were looking for another source of slaves, and Portuguese people were going, hey, Africa's right there. But that doesn't really answer why Africa. And then we've got a question of what is the impact? What effect does the New World slave trade have on Africa? So we're going to answer each one of those questions in turn as we do all of this stuff. But before we do that, I want to read you something uh, about the novel Beloved by Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is an American author and wrote this novel Beloved. And in the introduction to it, she dedicated the novel to the quote 60 million gone, a reference to Africans taken from Africa and transported into New World slavery. And a lot of historians read this and essentially said that Toni Morrison ought to stick to literature because that's what she's good at. She's not good at history because they said it could not possibly have been 60 million people. But this is what historians do. We look at these sorts of things and we try to figure out what's the accuracy of that sort of statement. If somebody says it must be 60 million people, well, we're going to look at it and say, is it? Is it 60 million? And we're going to try to come up with a rationale for that number. So, first question is it 60 million? And these historians said could not possibly be 60 million. So, they looked at records and they looked at plantation records, they looked at ship manifests and all of this stuff, and they looked at all of this and said, by looking at all of these vessels, we can determine that over the course of all of the slave trade, there were 28,000, give or take, I'm just going to kind of round it off. There were 28,000 voyages from Africa to the New World bringing enslaved peoples. And when those vessels got to the Americas, not the United States, when they got to the Americas, 12 to 16 million people got off those boats. So the number is 12 to 16 million, not 60 million. But those people were criticized. That first group was criticized because they only looked at the end point. They said, we've got 12 to 16 million people getting off the boats. We know, and a next group of historians, a second group comes in and alters all of this. They come in and look at it and say, you guys didn't look at what goes on between Africa and getting these people to the New World. By examining those ship records and examining the insurance records attached to those ships, we know, historians know, that approximately 20% of enslaved people died en route to the Americas between 1500 and 1600, or between 1500 and 1700. And then in the 1700s, approximately 10 to 15% of the enslaved died from Africa in transport to the New World. So if we take those numbers, if we take the 12 to 16 million, and then we take the insurance records and add that to all of this stuff, we've got at least 3 to 4 million people dying along the way. So the second generation of historians says it's not really 12 to 16 million. 12 to 16 million people did arrive, but we've also got that 3 to 4 million who died to account for. So the second group says it's actually 15 to 20 million. The number needs to be revised upward. And that's fine. The first group says, you know what, you're right. We looked at this in the wrong way, and you guys are absolutely right. But historians don't stop at that point. There's always new historians being trained, and they always come up with their own questions about research. And virtually this third group of historians comes along and they say, you guys are still looking at this improperly. You are looking at the moment enslaved people get onto the vessels to the moment that they get off of the vessels. But what happens before they get on the vessels? And what these historians found out by examining the investment records of people who were involved in the slave trade is they found out that slave investors created these things called factories. Now, don't think of it in terms of a factory that cranks out, pens or whatever. A factory, the term factory comes from the word benefactor, an investor. An investor puts money into something and creates a factor in that industry. So the factories are where the investment is actually held. So we know that they built these big buildings along the coast that they called factories to hold the investment, to hold the actual slaves, the people bound for slavery. We know that people were marched from the interior of Africa to the west coast of Africa to be put into those factories. They were held together by coffles again. We know that half of the people who came into those factories never got put on a ship. They died in the factories before they could actually be put on a ship. So, if that's the case, this third group of historians said we're talking about another 15 to 20 million. So, let's do our little revision upward again. 15 to 20 million people get put on ships. That's the 12 to 15 who made it to the New World, plus the 3 to 4 million who died along the way. So 15 to 20 million get put onto the ships. And then the 15 to 20 million who died before they got on a ship. And again, remember, we have insurance records that demonstrate this. So this isn't historians going, it's double. We've got the insurance records. Remember, the book that you're being asked to read this semester is The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. It's about commodifying enslaved people. So these enslaved people are a commodity. They are insured because the owners want to make sure that they are compensated correctly. So we've got the insurance records that demonstrate this. So it's not 12 to 16 million. It's actually 30 to 40 million people. Now, seems like we've reached our end point, except another group of historians gets trained and comes along. And I keep calling them generations. It's not like this happens every 25 years. It's just that if I had graduate students and trained them, they would be, quote, the next generation of grad students. So this next group of grad students comes along, and as they're trying to work on their own research, their question develops, and the thing that they're thinking is, we're only looking at slaves who are taken, or people who are taken from the interior of Africa, taken to the coastlines, and then traded to the New World. What about people who are traded elsewhere in the world? What about people who are traded to, say, Persia, as it was called at the time? What about people who are transported to North Africa and enslaved in places like Morocco and present-day Libya? What about people who are sold and transported to India in this institution? And if we look at that number, again, we're looking at approximately 20 million more people. 20 million more people who are transported to slavery or are bound for transport to North Africa, the Persian Gulf, and to India combined. So it's not 20 million each of those places, but 20 million combined. So let's revise our number again. If it's the 15 to 20 million transported to the New World, remember, 12 to 16 arrive, 3 to 4 million die along the way, so that's the 15 to 20. Then we've got the 15 to 20 million dead before the transport, and then we've got another 20 million who are actually sent elsewhere. We're looking at 50 to 60 million. So now Toni Morrison doesn't sound so crazy talking about quote 60 million gone. Now, a current group of historians is looking at another question. We have so far in this class been talking about slavery in Western Africa. So the next question becomes, well, okay, but that's just West Africa. What about the eastern coast of Africa? Historians know that there was a thriving trade of people from Eastern Africa to the same points, to the New World, to Persia, India, and North Africa, to the South Pacific. We know that slaves were sent to those areas as well. So when these students finish their research and start coming up with their conclusions, we might be revising this number to to possibly double it. Okay, it's too early to tell right now. It's too early to know for sure what the numbers are, but we may wind up revising this upward and moving it way upward again. So it's a large number of people, no matter how one looks at it, whether they look at the 12 to 16 million, whether they want to look at 50 to 60 million, it is an unbelievably large number. Now, how were these people captured? How did they become enslaved? Well, for the most part, those who were captured or who were enslaved were POWs. They were prisoners of war. Roughly half of the people bound for enslavement in the New World were prisoners of war. Instead of freeing captives during warfare, those captives were frequently enslaved in various African political traditions. And then when Europeans started purchasing enslaved people, those African kingdoms and principalities and city-states, they would sell their prisoners of war to Europeans, so they would wind up in this system. The other half of people were spread out amongst a number of other different circumstances that we can roughly call judicial proceedings. Punishment for crime might result in a sentence to slavery. Punishment for debt might resolve itself in punishment by slavery. Things like marital infidelity, things like destruction of property, things like destruction of communal property might wind up with someone being punished by being sold into slavery. And roughly half of the other half of people were sold into slavery through this particular process. This is why historians like myself talk about the system already existing and then Europeans tapping into that system and altering it. For example, Europeans gave African nations and African kingdoms, they gave them guns, they facilitated wars with one another. They made it clear, we want you to take captives. We want you to go to war, and we want you to take captives. So they create this system that was one thing, and then it becomes much, much bigger courtesy of that European involvement. Okay, so Europeans tap into it and alter it. And before anybody, if we were in person, you could ask the question, well, didn't people resist? Sure, of course. Lots of countries, lots of kingdoms, lots of principalities resisted this sort of stuff. But think of it in these terms. There's always somebody who's going to be willing to do this. Africa, during this period, had roughly, just like Europe did, had roughly 700 separate autonomously political regions, or politically autonomous regions. Easy for me to say. Politically autonomous regions. So, if a European group comes in and says, we want you to go to war with that group of people over there, and this group says, you know what, I'm taking the long view of this, and this is going to be a bad idea for everybody, so I'm not going to do it. Europeans had 698 other groups that they could go to foment war against that other group of people. So it's simply a matter of going down the line until you find the group of people who's going to be willing to participate. All right? So not everybody went along. Plenty of resisted, but the problem was you could always find someone else willing to take the money and take the European trade goods. Now, the next question is why Africa? We still really haven't talked about why Africa. And the answer for why Africa is actually, again, kind of startlingly simple. The simplest answer is that they already had a system of slavery in place. And why that's important is that slavery is not outside the realm of understanding of most people in Africa. It's not like being enslaved is a shock to people. Not from the standpoint of they wanted to be enslaved, and this is, I admit, a terrible comparison. But nobody likes getting a traffic ticket, but it's not something that, like, getting a traffic ticket blows your mind because it's incomprehensible to you. Same sort of thing here. Nobody wanted to be enslaved, but it's part of the everyday fabric of these societies. So they know it. They understand that it's part of society. Okay. So Africa having this system uh, was was a key part of this. What's unusual in this system is how Europeans alter it once they've involved themselves, and how slavery changes once these people are in the New World. But as far as Africa having a system in place, you know, this is part of why Europeans go there. They can plug right into an existing system. But there's another factor here as well. West Africa became was already politically fragmented as Europeans are coming in. There were powerful kingdoms in Africa. There were also a number of autonomous city states. There were things that would change all the way down to what we might call tribal structures. But there's all these different groups in between, which is why I said if you've got 700 different groups of people that you could deal with to do this sort of stuff, that's quite literally political fragmentation. So there's no such thing as quote unquote African unity to prevent Europeans from plugging into all of this. So political fragmentation is a cause, but as we're going to see here on the next slide, political fragmentation is also effect when it comes to slavery. So politically fragmented is the cause here, but if we want to look at the impact of slavery on Africa, well, it's also an impact, it's also an effect. If you think about those nations, those kingdoms, those city-states, the principalities, all of those things start to break down. African legal institutions start to break down as slavery gets in, as Europeans get involved in slavery and alter these societies. So political fragmentation turns into political instability on top of all of that stuff. So that's one thing that we can look at, political instability. But there's also some other things that we need to look at. Massive depopulation should be a given. You should not have needed me to even tell you massive depopulation. If we're talking about 12 to 16 million or 60 million, that's a massive amount of humanity just gone. Now, another problem here is that it also wildly alters the population in another way. The slave trade early on concentrated on young adult males. Census data from the slave era demonstrates when Europeans started coming into Africa and exerting even more political control, they started demanding censuses. So, one of the things that we note by the time the 1600s roll around is that for every 100 women aged 18 to 50, there were only 50 men aged 18 to 50. So that's a 2-to-1 ratio here. There's 2 women aged 18 to 50 for every 1 male aged 18 to 50. That means it's harder for children to be fathered. That's a given. There's far more women than there are men. That's going to keep the birth rate way down. Another problem is that these societies in West Africa were overwhelmingly patriarchal, meaning male-controlled and male-dominated. So politics involved men. Farming and agriculture involved men. Virtually any decision within society was made by men. Okay, and once those men are gone, there's a power vacuum. So there's an alteration within these West African societies where they're patriarchal or patrilineal, and then all of a sudden women are going to have to come in and pick up the slack, and this is going to alter how they conceive of themselves politically, how they conceive of themselves socially. So we see the skewed sex ratios within West Africa causing all sorts of problems and chaos within West Africa. Another problem is that when Europeans start sending in massive amounts of manufactured goods to trade for slaves, it also upsets and displaces African industries. And I mentioned this a little bit in the Close Encounters lecture. But Africa had tons of industry during this period. There was mining and metal working in West Africa. There was iron working in West Africa. There was a textile industry in West Africa. And all of these industries come to a grinding halt because of the slave trade. All of those men are taken out, so they are not participating in these. Plus, African consumers can buy what they need. They don't need all of this stuff to be manufactured. So all of their industry just collapses as a consequence of the slave trade. The sum total of all of this is that there's economic development that begins in the 16th century, the 1500s, and Africa is still recovering from it 500 plus years into the future. In 2020, West Africa still has not completely recovered from this devastation. Now, there are two stories about slavery. One of them is a story that we've already started to see that we're going to make worse, and that is a story of exploitation with a horrifically long legacy, and it's an incredibly depressing legacy. And we're going to add to that depressing legacy part of this by now talking about the Middle Passage. Probably, if we're being honest, I don't even think you need to throw the word probably into this. But the ugliest part of the African slave trade into the New World. We are going to define the Middle Passage as the forced removal of at least 60 million Africans to the New World. The forced removal of 60 million Africans to the New World. Now, the reason it's called the Middle Passage is if you look at the map on the screen, you see goods coming from North America. You see essentially raw materials like cotton, sugar, tobacco, molasses, that sort of stuff being sent to Europe. And European nations transform those raw materials into manufactured goods. And then they take those manufactured goods, they sail southward to Africa, and they sell a lot of those manufactured goods to people in African nations, to various traders. And then the ships, the same ships that they loaded up with manufactured goods, once they're empty, those ships are then loaded up with enslaved people and sent across the Atlantic. So there's a middle section here. You can see it literally just has slaves in it. Okay, that middle section is called the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage is the transport of slaves from Africa to the New World. It's the middle portion of this triangle trade scheme, as it was called. So once those ships got to the New World, slaves would be offloaded at various ports, and then those ships would move up the coast. They'd take on the raw materials again, the sugar, the tobacco, the cotton, the molasses, and then they'd go back to Europe, and the whole process would start again. This is an incredibly horrific voyage. This Middle Passage took approximately 3 to 4 months to get these people across the Atlantic. And the people are undoubtedly crammed into the cargo holds of these vessels. The ship's cargo holds were converted into a quote-unquote quarter of sorts for the enslaved cargo. They accounted for 6 feet in length, 16 inches in width, and 2.7 inches in depth for an adult male. For women, 5 feet 10 inches. For boys, 5 feet 4 inches in length. And for girls, 4 feet 6 inches in length. Based on these types of calculations, the average ship that carried slaves from Africa to the New World could cram 450 people into that cargo hold. Now, it's already close quarters. It's already, quote, cramped, if you will. But slave ship owners made this worse. They frequently stuffed more than 600 people into these cargo holds. And the reason they did it is very simple. They know that some of these people are going to die along the way. So if that's going to happen, we need to cram these things, their thought is, We need to cram these things full of as many enslaved people we can to mitigate our losses. Now, again, this voyage takes 3 to 4 months. So these people have been crammed into the cargo holds. In some cases, they're stacked on top of one another. They're crammed in there for 3 to 4 months. Now, once these people got to the New World, they suffered from all sorts of diseases, things like dysentery, for example. Dysentery was a big problem for people who got off of those slave ships. It's a bowel inflammation and an intestinal inflammation that causes really drastic problems for the sufferer. And the reason people got dysentery in these cargo holds is because the conditions were horrific. There literally was no restroom in these cargo holds. And these people are chained together anyway. So it's not like they're going to be able to just get up and walk to a restroom. Where these people urinate, where they defecate, where they throw up is right where they are. And unless it's exercise day, they are going to just kind of, and even if people said we're going to have exercise once a day, until that moment, the cargo hold is full of people who are laying in absolute abject filth. Now, these ship holds were actually cleaned, not particularly well, nor particularly frequently. What would happen is that the captain of the vessel understood that if you leave these people down there for 3 to 4 months, they're going to suffer from all sorts of muscle atrophy and the like. They're not going to be able to stand up. They'll be useless as a quote unquote investment. So they've got to be exercised fairly regularly. So he would order that the enslaved would be brought up to the top deck, where they would be literally forced to exercise. They'd be forced to walk along the deck. They'd be forced to, in many cases, perform dances, perform their own indigenous dances for the entertainment of the ship's crew. But by doing this would get them exercise so they wouldn't suffer from the muscle atrophy. And then while they're up on the top deck, the cargo hold would be cleaned in a sort of basic way. The sailors would throw buckets that had a mixture of seawater and vinegar into the cargo hold. And then the cargo, because the ship is on the ocean, it's kind of going back and forth like this. And so all of that stuff would be sloshed around in that cargo hold and then bailed out. And that's it. That's the extent of it. Okay, so there is no sanitizing. There's no scrubbing things until stains come out or anything like that. It's just basically rinse it off, bail it out, and then send everybody back down into the cargo hold. Now, just like I talked about when it came to the actual individual nations, individual Africans themselves fought back on a fairly frequent basis. We don't often talk about this in history. About slave rebellions on the seas. But we know, again, that there were at least 2,800 known revolts on these slave ships. Insurance records tell us of this, that people were killed by virtue of this slave rebellion or that slave rebellion. So we know that there were almost 3,000 slave rebellions. However, these were stopped, these were stopped and they were put down violently. There were a handful of successful ones, but overwhelmingly they were put down violently. People resorted to other means of individual protest against this. A lot of people would wind up throwing themselves overboard and committing suicide in that way. Ship captains wound up understanding that this was a possible problem, so they started putting cargo netting around the vessels to stop people from actually being able to do that. Other people resisted by refusing to eat. If they did that, they would wind up tied to the main mast of the ship, so that in front of everybody, a captain would order a sailor to take a rifle. The butt of a rifle or the butt of a pistol and knock that person's teeth out and then basically force feed them a type of paste that everybody was supposed to eat. And that person would wind up being made an example of. Now, that's an extreme example because, again, it means that you're damaging, quote, property. So captains didn't like to do that, but they also thought, their thought also was, is that if I do this to one, I won't have to worry about having to do it to 450 or 500 or 600 people. So they were willing to take the gamble, so to speak. One case that demonstrated just how ugly this stuff could be was a vessel called the Zong. The Zong wound up having a capacity of approximately 175. Again, using those types of calculations I talked about before, the Zong had a capacity of about 175 people in the cargo hold. However, the ship's captain insured it with 442 people in the cargo hold. So it was wildly over capacity. Now, this means that there were already going to be shortages and problems on that ship. And it was all made worse when this captain made a navigational error. This ship is sailing to the United States in the 1780s. And what winds up happening is, after this navigational error is made, the captain said, we're going to have to do something drastic because we're going to run out of food, we're going to run out of water, and lots of people are going to die. So what he did, arguing that the enslaved were insured cargo, he said, I can simply throw these people overboard, and once we're done, I can file an insurance claim, and we will not lose any money on this voyage. Now, that is an unbelievably repulsive and cynical way to look at this trade, and yet he does it. And for what it's worth, the insurance company initially paid the claim until one of the sailors got to a point where he said he couldn't live with himself. So he said, I can't stand this. Got to get this out. And he basically ratted out the captain of the ship. The insurance company demanded their money back. It created this massive lawsuit in England. And ultimately, when all was said and done, the slave trade basically was killed in England. The publicity behind the case of the Zong turned public opinion wildly against the slave trade until ultimately the British government banned the slave trade, and they did so as a direct result of this circumstance on the Zong. Now we're going to move into the Americas with the slave trade, and we're going to look at some issues here. If we look at the population of African Americans, and African Americans, again, this is a term that we use in the United States, but we may not necessarily always understand. African American can refer to anyone who is of African descent who lives anywhere in the Americas. So, quote unquote Afro Canadians also are quote African Americans. People who live in the United States and are of African descent can be referred to as African Americans. All across South America and Central America, these folks could also be referred to as African Americans. So when I say this, a third of African Americans today live in the United States. You shouldn't have the question, well, don't 100%, because we're referring to people of African descent throughout North and South America when we use this term African American. So 1/3 of African Americans live in the United States. However, they live in the United States. But when we look at the numbers of people brought from Africa to the New World, only about 6% were brought to what became the United States. 94% went someplace else, and the someplace else is mostly the Caribbean and South America. And yet today, the United States has the overwhelmingly largest population of African Americans. But I mean, think about that. On the one hand, the overwhelmingly largest population, but only 6% of the people were brought to what became the United States. So how could it be? Well, the answer is a simple issue of biology in the form of sex ratios again. In this era in the 1400s and in the 1500s and in the 1600s, when all of these people, the overwhelming majority of people, 94% are brought to the Caribbean islands. The Caribbean slaveholders wanted only male slaves. They did not want female slaves. Now, that's not to say that they didn't take female slaves, because a lot of times they were forced to. It's just a question of they didn't want to take female slaves. As they saw it, male enslaved people were capable of doing the hard work of sugarcane production, while women were incapable of that. So women didn't have a value to these guys. However, it also did something else that that created a very distinct culture within the Caribbean. Now, all of these males are coming over, and the reason they're bringing so many over, the reason it's just kind of a flood of people is they came to the conclusion in the Caribbean that we're going to work these enslaved people until literally they drop dead, because we have such a consistent flow of quote unquote replacement slaves. It's actually cheaper in the long run to bring in new slaves than try to have a reproducing slave population. So they just constantly ensured this flow of male slaves. Now, they're working these enslaved people to death, but in what becomes the United States, they didn't have that, quote, luxury, if you will. The Caribbean got the first pick, so to speak. So when those slave vessels make it up to what becomes the United States, they've got far fewer options. So they take a lot more female slaves. And what they rely on in the United States is they rely on the idea that these enslaved peoples will get married, that they will have children, and they'll be able to enslave the children, thus perpetuating the institution of slavery. So in the North American colonies, the colonies that belong to Great Britain, they have far more women, but it's also a society that is capable of self-reproduction. Now, early on, while I told you that right now the largest population of African Americans is in the United States, courtesy of all of this stuff, initially the Caribbean, had by far a much, much larger enslaved population. They also had far, far more revolts and runaway slaves. However, they also developed something distinct that were called maroon communities, or quilombos, as they were also called. These quilombos, or maroon communities, were communities of runaway slaves, enslaved people who had run away from various plantations and wound up living with indigenous peoples or forming self-sustaining communities of runaway slaves. But what they wound up doing was they're consciously rejecting and resisting the institution of slavery through these maroon communities. Now, revolts, because of this, were a fairly common thing, and there were lots of these maroon communities across South America. The most successful maroon community ever was a place called Palmeiras that existed in present-day Brazil. Palmeiras had ultimately swelled to 30,000 inhabitants. So there were a lot of people who ran away from enslavement and intermarried and had children and grew this massive resistance community. However, Palmeiras winds up being destroyed by a combined European army. There were a bunch of different countries involved in South America, and they really didn't agree on a whole lot of stuff, but they did agree that having these communities of runaway slaves was a bad thing. It was a challenge to the authority of these countries. So this combined army came in and wiped out Palmeiras. They literally killed all of the inhabitants at Palmeiras to demonstrate that this is our resolve. This is what we're going to do. Now, there were also maroon communities in what becomes the United States, but just not at the same, not to the same level, not anywhere near the same number. But arguably, the most famous maroon community existed in what becomes the United States. The Seminole community out of Florida was also a maroon community. The Seminole were and are a group who descended from runaway slaves, from indigenous people, Indians in Florida, as well as pirates who intermarried with this group. So the Seminoles are actually a mishmash of a number of different ethnic groups. So this one side, this one story of slavery is this incredibly depressing story. It's an effort where these people are taken from their ancestral homes. They are deculturated. There's an effort to strip them of their names, of their religion, of their identities, all in an effort to turn them into obedient workers. However, human beings always resist this sort of stuff, and these people are no different. Enslaved Africans always resisted. However, they didn't always revolt in overt ways. Now, later on this semester, you're going to read Fires of Jubilee about Nat Turner's rebellion. That is overt reaction. You're fighting back. It's obvious. It's physically involved. You can see it. Okay, you can see what's happening. But a better way, or sometimes a better way, sometimes a more effective way of resisting is through what's called covert means, covert resistance. And it's through covert resistance, the development of family, the development of religion, the development of kinship networks that enslaved Africans most effectively resisted enslavement. And in the process, these enslaved Africans created virtually everything that we call American culture. So American culture is absolutely intertwined with quote unquote African culture. For example, when I say that these enslaved Africans created virtually everything we think of things like American English. American English has phrases like uh-huh and uh-uh. They have words like yam and jazz and things like that. All of those words come out of an African origin. All of those phraseologies like uh-huh and uh-uh, those are African linguistic techniques. These do not exist in traditional English. They wouldn't exist without Africans creating this very specific style of American English. Once Africans are brought once they are engaged in communication with English slave owners, they create a new type of American English that has different words, that has different types of phraseology and linguistic orders. American cuisine, things that we think of as Southern cooking, things that we might think of as soul food, these also come from an African origin. Things like deep fat frying, things like the creation of gumbo, fricasseing as a technique, the use of yams in that cooking. All of these things may be associated with Southern cooking, but they all also have African origins. Now, why this would be, why Africans would put this distinct spin on cuisine should be obvious enough to you, but I'm going to tell you flat out how it works, is that you have these slave owners who say we're going to use slaves to do literally all of our labor. Now, they're not going to give these enslaved people a cookbook and say, here, I want you to make these recipes right here. They're going to say, here is the food, you cook it. So the enslaved Africans are going to use the techniques that they are already aware of. They're going to use the foods that they know of to accent this stuff. Slave owners or slave traders went to Africa and learned and discovered things like yam. They discovered rice growing in places like Angola and transported that along with enslaved peoples to the New World, so that these people are going to start growing and using yams and rice in Southern cooking. So it's not a coincidence that you have this blending, this amalgamation of different cultures happening with cuisine. American music is deeply indebted to African origins, to African influences. We associate things like the banjo with country music and with bluegrass music. However, it came from an African instrument that was adapted to the hill country. Even the word banjo, that's another example of an African word being used to describe this instrument. So banjo is of African origin in virtually every way. The word jazz was actually an African word that described a sort of meandering style of music and then got passed down through generations and generations and generations, so that by the late 1800s, when people are starting to create what we call jazz music in the United States, the descendants of the enslaved had an African word that they could use to describe this music, and so they started calling it jazz. Other things like yodeling. Yodeling is something that we tend to associate with Central European cultures, but Americans in the 19th century didn't have a ton of contact with Central Europeans. But what they did have contact with was a lot of people of African origin who had learned how to yodel. They had learned yodeling, and it had been passed down throughout several generations. So that, again, these people were keeping something alive from an African tradition and then kind of importing it and plugging it in to American music. Also, things like the technique of falsetto singing, even the construction of, uh, of spiritual songs. These are all things that have a connection to African musical techniques, and they wind up being plugged into American music. American religion has a connection to and is altered by virtue of contact with enslaved Africans. There's a sermon style that's associated with evangelicals called the call and response style of sermon. And that is an African oratorical technique. So, and for those of you who don't know what call and response is, a real simple call and response is the preacher standing up there going, "Can I get an amen?" And the whole congregation goes, "Amen." That's call and response. So that's an African oratorical technique, that gets put into something in American culture that alters the American culture. The idea of spirituality, or maybe spirituality is the wrong word. Maybe we ought to call it spiritism. That also is something that is an African an African religious idea, where the idea here is that people gained insight by communication with the spirit world. By communing with long dead relatives, they could gain insight, they could gain wisdom. So people talked in traditional African religions, and I hate using that phrase because there is no quote African religion. There's a number of different African traditions, but within those African traditions, one commonality is that people would become, quote, infused with the spirit of their ancestors, and this would give them this type of wisdom. So it's no surprise that when, in a period called the Second Great Awakening in the United States, when slaveholders started talking about Christianity and became really interested and really concerned with the idea of converting the enslaved, they started putting in things and applying things that they knew would appeal to peoples of African origin. They would bring in preachers who were former slaves or enslaved themselves, who could kind of speak the language, so to speak, of the enslaved, and they would come in here and say, "Look, just like people got infused with the spirit of our ancestors back home in Africa, you can convert to Christianity and become infused with the Holy Spirit. This will give you insight and wisdom into how to be a better Christian." So again, the idea here is you're taking African ideas, plugging it in to something in the United States, and creating something different. Now, we actually have a term for that sort of idea, that sort of process. The term is called syncretization. Syncretization is called, or is defined as the selective fusion or blending of the elements of two or more separate cultures or practices in order to form something new. And African religion and its connection to Christianity is one of these areas where we can see syncretization probably better than anywhere else. A reason why the conversion efforts of African Americans in the 1800s was not as difficult as many people thought it might be wasn't because people of African descent simply said, "Look, we're here. We've now been enslaved for 300 plus years in this country. So what the hell? We might as well give in to Christianity. It's not like that. It's not like they just gave up. It's a matter of taking Christianity and making it something that worked for them, that they could actually understand. So these traditional African religions that I talked about a couple of seconds ago, they again had a few things in common that made it easier for people to do this. These religions were what we call non-exclusive, meaning they didn't hear things and go, la, 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 that doesn't go with what I was told, so I don't have to listen to it. They listened to things and said, oh, that actually kind of makes sense, so I'm going to incorporate that into my worldview. They're also eclectic, meaning that they draw from a number of different traditions. Okay, if you're non-exclusive, almost by definition, you're going to be eclectic. And then they also don't have authoritative texts, meaning that, first of all, there were Christians across Africa, there were Muslims across Africa, there were Jews across Africa, and they all had authoritative texts. Jews with the Torah, Christians with the New Testament, Islam with the Quran. All of those religions had that authoritative text that said, these are the beliefs, this is what we do, this is our dogma, these are our stories. But those quote unquote traditional African religions, those that fell outside the spectrum of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they didn't have that authoritative text. So these people didn't have a guidepost to tie things to and go, well, I'm going to do this, but it's not in the Quran, so I can't do that. They didn't have that guidepost. Okay, and to be fair, when people talk about Christianity and Islam and Judaism being that way, that might be a little overstated too. But these traditional African religions were even more open to these other ideas because of a lack of an authoritative text. So syncretization could actually work fairly well here when it comes to the field of religion. Even things like architecture were influenced by African traditions. Things like porches did not exist on English cottages back home in England because, that's not how people built homes. They also had a very distinct construction style where in England, they took stones and piled them on top of one another to construct everything that they lived in or worked in. And they adapted that in the Americas. When English settlers first came to the Americas, they don't have stones, but they do cut down lots of trees and make logs out of it, and they stack logs on top of each other to make basically log cabins. Well, when they bring enslaved Africans over to the Americas, and again, tell Africans, here are the materials, that's where we want the house, that's where it's going to be built. Enslaved Africans used construction techniques that they knew from their own lives. So when they constructed a house had a porch. So they built porches on these houses. They also used what we call frame construction, meaning they build up a rough frame and then they put the materials around the frame. And all you have to do to see which idea wins out, whether you stack stuff on top of one another or whether you use frame construction, just drive around the city sometime and look at all of the construction. They all build essentially a skeleton of the building and then build materials into that. So frame construction becomes the standard, and it's part of this African tradition. And rice cultivation, I already mentioned this a little bit, but people in Western Africa, particularly Angola, had already been cultivating rice far before Europeans and then later Americans would be going into Africa. And people understood the importance of this of rice cultivation. They knew that it could be a sustainable crop that would actually sustain large populations. So when Europeans started bringing enslaved people over from Angola, they also brought rice, and that rice cultivation was actually introduced in various parts of the New World, but particularly in places like Georgia and South Carolina. All of this stuff happens because you've got large concentrations of these West African peoples who know about rice cultivation. So it alters how the United States functions from a cultural standpoint. Now, to kind of tie a bow around all of this stuff, I want to read you a quote from Morgan Freeman. A few years ago, Morgan Freeman got into this really ugly PR problem because he had said on 60 Minutes, he had said something that seemed to attack the idea of Black History Month. And basically, he said, I don't want a Black History Month. And people reported that in the news literally the next day saying, Morgan Freeman blasts Black History Month. But what they weren't doing was taking a second to understand the context of what Morgan Freeman had actually said. What he actually said was the following. He said, "You're going to relegate my history to only a month? I don't want a Black History, quote, month." He said, because Black history is American history. So it's a matter of saying what Morgan Freeman was actually saying here was that you cannot talk about American history without talking about Black history. The two are distinctly intertwined. So hopefully, if you take away nothing else from this last hour and 40 minutes or so, please take away the understanding that African American history and American history are very distinctly intertwined. You cannot talk about American history without talking about African Americans. You can't talk about American history without talking about slavery. So I thank you for your time, and we'll see you next time in Lecture 3, which is, I believe, the age of Shakespeare, the era in which people started coming over from England and trying to colonize in the Americas. It happened during Shakespeare's lifetime, so we're going to talk about it in terms of the age of Shakespeare. See you next time.